Yeah, I started telling everybody down there that John MacArthur broke the internet by saying 2 words. And the problem was the 2 words were taken out of context, but were spoken in a particular context as well. And specifically, let's just remember, I think that Todd Friel invented the word snark. If he didn't, he was one of the first ones to use it, but he may have actually invented it. But I think probably the first place I ever heard anybody use it was Todd Friel. I mean that quite seriously. And so he is the very definition of snark. His entire shtick is snark. And so you have to put that in context and remember that it was in a Q&A with him that MacArthur used the term, was it disqualified? I think he was disqualified in regards to Stephen Furtick, who then wrote an entire book called Disqualified in response to it. And they even mentioned that. So when Todd starts off going, okay, word identification, most sane people are running off the stage at that point. The rest of us are tied down, and we know how sad Todd looks when he's rejected and unloved. So we just can't put up with it. So we stay there and put up with whatever happens. But most people want to run because you know you're going to be asked a question in the least comfortable possible way. I normally just ignore what the question is and say something useful. That's how I do it, and he can't stop me, so it's just the way it is. But Dr. MacArthur even said I'm being set up, and he was in a sense. But when Beth Moore's name was stated, and there was all this laughter, that's one of the things that's been turned into, oh, this was just so hateful. If you were in that room, I was not. If you were in that room and you have Todd Friel up there and Todd Friel starts like that, everyone's going to laugh because you just know that's Todd Friel. There wasn't anything misogynistic about that. I could not believe that there were people actually using the term misogyny. Well, I can believe it because they're woke. Their ultimate authority is critical theory and intersectionality and all this silliness, and so they're full on board with use the weaponized words, transphobia, homophobia, misogyny. These are weapon words. They are words that are meant to communicate pure negativity without actually having any truth content in and of themselves. Because anyone who argues that John MacArthur hates women because he doesn't believe that Beth Moore should be preaching to men for more than just the fact of her gender, the content of her books, the content of her tweets, the content, I mean, about 3 days earlier, was it about 3 days earlier? Or it was really close at the same time. I started seeing all this stuff in my feed about, do you want to make a snowman? And I'm sitting here thinking, did Clementine take over the internet? Because I remember Clementine's Frozen period, where everything was Elsa and all that kind of stuff. And so I had to, do you want to build a snowman? It's stuck. You hear it so many times. It's in the background, foreground. It's everywhere. It gets stuck in your brain. And then, of course, Clementine's debate with Jeff Durbin about Frozen, which Clementine won by a long shot. It wasn't even close. Jeff has improved a lot since his debate with Clementine. He was really good in our debate up there in Salt Lake, but Clementine crushed him. So we're still not sure whether he has a chin or not, but that's a completely other issue. I started seeing all this stuff, and then lo and behold, here's this stuff about Beth Moore talking about playing with Jesus, and they built a snowman together or something. I'm just like, okay, so there's a lot more behind John MacArthur's statement than just the fact that she's a woman. But that was the main thing, because I don't think Dr. MacArthur has spent much time reading any of Beth Moore's books. Or I can guarantee you he does not do her Twitter feed. No, that's not happening. So all this stuff is happening, and he makes the statement. And then later on, he expands in the same clip. He says, let me add, there is absolutely no argument for women preachers and so on. So he's just making a standard statement that would have caused everyone in the 1970s to go, why are you even saying this? Not everyone, but everyone in our circles anyways, to say, why are you even saying this? What's going on here? Things have changed. And then Phil, of course, his one-word response was narcissistic. If he had just stopped there and had not said what he then said afterwards, which was specifically that every time he listens to Beth Moore, she is seeking to insert herself into the biblical narrative. And you know what? As I think back, I don't listen to much Beth Moore. Most of the time when I've seen something, it's been the hair combing thing, or just today was her tweet, which she's blocked me, but this tweet where she's talking about this conversation with Jesus, and Jesus is, how's your day going, Beth? Well, I'm having a tough day. Would you like me to change it for you, Beth? I mean, it is the essence of Jesus as my boyfriend, girlfriend type stuff. And that is what I've seen. And what Phil said was she's always trying to read herself in the biblical narrative. That's narcissistic. To make it sound like Jesus' highest priority in the universe today is how Beth Moore is feeling because she's stressed out this morning, is a problem. It sort of goes along with another tweet that I saw from another woke individual that was talking about what the fear of God means. And by the time they got done talking, it was a whole long Twitter thing. Not a single lexical source was cited, of course. Because as I said somewhere else on Twitter this morning, or actually it was on our website. It was Facebook and then website and Twitter and stuff like that. As my Greek professor long ago, and I have reminded him of this a number of times, said, now the Greek word fear means fear. It was in a Life and Letters of Paul class, and I was the only person who was still conscious at that point. But I remember it very clearly, and he happens to be right. And so there is this fear of the Lord that nowhere appeared in any of these discussions. And the sappy sentimentality of this kind of stuff requires you to put yourself in the center. I am the most important person in the world to God. And there are songs like that. There are contemporary Christian songs like that. You just want to go, oh. The God-centeredness gone, man-centeredness everywhere. I'm not saying all CCM is like that. Don't get me wrong. There's some good stuff out there, but Phil went on to explain that's what he meant, and of course that was considered to be misogynistic and all the rest of this stuff. And remember, these are the same people that think that that Bible translation committees have to be diverse. That you have to have a certain number of minorities and a certain number of women and a certain number, who knows, pretty soon it'll be transgenders and all the rest of the stuff to get all the proper voices. Rather than, we just want to have the absolute best people who know translation, they know Greek and Hebrew, and they know English, and they know all the things you need to know to do a good job with this. And that's not our concern. So the internet gets broken. Unfortunately, I've attempted. I have not seen any response to this yet, but I have attempted a couple of times now to get people to focus upon. Look, there's to people who would identify as being on my side, whatever that might be. You need to remember something. There are certain subjects, there are two subjects that I'll mention that conservatives assume rather than prove. They assume them rather than prove them. I mentioned one of them at the end of the Q&A in Melbourne on Sunday evening. And that is the issue of the nature of eternal punishment. It is assumed, but in my experience, the vast majority of people don't know why they assume it, and they figure everyone believes like they do. And as a result, most people aren't able to interact much when challenged in that particular area, because it is accepted because it's assumed rather than studied. And there are certain fundamental underlying assumptions, such as you cease sinning when you die. Somehow you become regenerate and you no longer sin. Certain issues like that need to be recognized and understood that just aren't a general part of the conversation. And the other is the horrifically named complementarian, egalitarian. Is there any other dispute in the church that has worse marketing, tagging, naming than that? You cannot even say that 3 times fast without speaking tongues. It's horrible. But that particular, if you are not aware of the fact that, for example, in the Timothy passage, 2:12, that the verb that is used there is argued by egalitarians. Why don't you do that right, 2 Timothy? 1 Timothy. Get the right number. I can't type today. That's one thing. But I do not allow women to teach or exercise authority over man, but to remain quiet. Alphantine is the term that is used there. And Loanita define it as to control in a domineering manner. So to control a domineering manner is often expressed idiomatically, for example, to shout orders at, to act like a chief toward, to bark at. That's Loanita. If you look at BDAG, to assume a stance of independent authority, give orders to, dictate. So that's a little less. Loanita can have spin in some of the things that it says, but BDAG is a little better. To assume a stance of independent authority. So I'll say, see, it's independent authority. So what they will argue is that Alphantine in 1 Timothy 2:12 is an inordinate claim of authority. So this guy on Twitter today, he hasn't responded to me because I've asked for some documentation. But this guy was saying that there was a single woman who had inserted herself improperly into the leadership of the church in Ephesus. And that this is just a single historical context, and Timothy's there. And so Paul's only dealing with that. Okay? So if you're not familiar with the arguments and usages of Alphantine, and if you aren't up on, well, what about Corinthians? I mean, there were women prophesying in Corinth, and what's that about? Then you're assuming stuff and just throwing that stuff out and saying, well, see, Paul's on my side. There's always another side. And if you haven't listened to the other side and know how to respond to it, be careful how bold you are in throwing your arguments out. These are 2 areas where that's exactly what ends up happening. So what I've done, and nobody cares, I haven't seen anybody pick up on it, so I seem to be the only person even raising the issue. But my simple question is, you say you believe in sola scriptura. A lot of them don't. I mean, one of the first things you abandon when you start going woke, going liberal, going left, is sola scriptura, because you no longer believe that it's actually sufficient. But if you say you believe in it, which any Southern Baptist has to say for now until they can get enough of a majority again to change the Baptist faith and message, which will result in, the utter obliteration of the denomination as a whole, which may be coming anyways. There are large churches leaving right now, and they're explaining why. And it's very obvious that J.D. Greear is way to the left, and who knows what's going to be coming after this. And, Beth Moore's name has been put up for the presidency of the SBC more than once. And that might not happen as long as the conservatives are still around. But if there's a split, then you could see her being made president almost immediately by the whatever split goes left. But her name's out there. But I have said, believe in sola scriptura? All right, simple question for you. Why are there no qualifications for women elders in the New Testament? There are for men who are elders. There are for deacons who are also men. That's all there. So what are the arguments the other direction? Well, we only just happen to have those qualifications. That doesn't mean that Paul didn't have qualifications for the women elders or the women deacons. They just aren't included in any of the extant correspondence that we have, which means God did not want to have that in the content of the New Testament. So you have to take a view that what we have in the New Testament is accidental. It's just what happened to survive, what happened to be collected by the churches. There's no spiritual aspect to this. It just happens to be the way it was. And that ends up leading eventually to a degradation of the view of Scripture, which allows for external tradition to then take over and fill in the gaps. That's generally how that ends up going. But I think that if you follow the Reformed perspective, and look, lots of Reformed churches that have the name Reformed in their name have collapsed on this issue. But the first thing that had to go was not the regulative principle of worship, but the regulative principle of theology. And that is that you need to have positive biblical foundation for positive doctrinal assertions. And so if you want to know what the eldership of the church looks like, you can go to Acts. You can look at the historical reality. You can go to the statement in Acts, I think it's 14, that this is a part of strengthening the churches, whereas the apostle providing leadership in the form of elders, plural, for the churches. Elders in the churches, not an elder, but elders in the churches. And when you ask what the qualifications were, well, let's remember, again, for liberals, there is a limited Pauline corpus. You may think Paul wrote 13, maybe 14 epistles in the New Testament, but people like Bart Ehrman and more professors in seminaries than you might guess do not believe that Paul wrote the pastorals. Hence, 1 Timothy 2 isn't even Paul. So you can see anybody who buys into that perspective and doesn't believe that this is Pauline and yet calls it Scripture. How do you make that work? You make that work by having an external traditional authority in the church that elevates this pseudepigraphal writing, not even, well, it's pseudepigraphal, it's forgery, to the level of Scripture. Once you do that, give it one generation, and that system will fall apart. It can't hold together. So part of a long-term strategy for defending a biblical form of the church will include learning the arguments not only for apostolic authorship of all the New Testament books, but against the argumentation that is given and simply accepted in liberal circles as to why you shouldn't believe that these books are written by Paul. And the arguments stink. The arguments are horrific. They are circular to the nth degree. Well, I think one of the clearest evidences is that the form of the church found in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus developed later in history, as we can see by looking at Corinth. In other words, you assume that the church that had the most problems had to receive the most apostolic correspondence, and we know from the letter of Rome to the church at Corinth was not even corrected by that. So you look at the worst case example, extrapolate out from there. And so instead of seeing that Ephesus, for example, plainly had functioning eldership and the whole 9 yards, early on, continues to have it in the book of Revelation, you ignore that and say, no, this all-male eldership, that develops later in history, and the primitive period, even during Paul's life, was just, anything goes type stuff. It's Corinth. And so you have that argumentation, the circular argumentation of, well, I'm going to assume that the church looked like this, and therefore anything that doesn't look like this means that it was written later. That's one of the main arguments used in liberal seminaries against the Pauline authorship of those epistles. Then what goes along with it? It's different vocabulary. You have different terminology being used in the pastoral epistles than you have in what are accepted to be the genuine Pauline epistles, such as Romans and Galatians. The problem with that is there's a huge difference between Galatians and Romans. Oh yeah, you've got a lot of the same vocabulary. The grammar and syntax is different, and there's a reason for that. Paul's really ticked off when he writes Galatians, and he may have written it himself. See with what large letters I've written. Maybe he had an eye problem. We don't know, because it's not all that long a letter, so it doesn't make any sense to understand that large letter as in large. It may have been he wrote it himself, but we know he dictated Romans. He tells us who he dictated it to. So when you get to determine what the starting set of vocabulary is, you can make anybody. If I take Bart Ehrman's scholarly works and compare his popular works, Bart Ehrman did not write both of them. The vocabulary, syntax, and style is different. He has different editors. He's writing to a different audience. He's going to use different terminology. Same thing with the pastorals. If you're writing to your friend, if I write to, if I even had time to write to Michael and David and Andrew and all the guys down in Sydney and Melbourne, where I just was, about, we talked about church stuff. So let's say I wrote to them and talked to them about church stuff, sort of like the pastoral epistles. If I wrote emails like that, but then they asked me, hey, could you write something for our church on this doctrine? And then you compare the vocabulary, they're going to be different. And so if you make that as the basis for determining authorship, it's obvious. When Paul's writing Romans and he wants this to be an epistle that is read by many for a long period of time in an important church, and then he's writing to his dear brother Timothy right before his death, you really expect those to be identical to one another in vocabulary and form and structure? That's absurd. But that's the argumentation. That's the argumentation. That's what's behind it all. Are we aware of these things? And most of the time we're not. And so we need to be. We need to be. There's more study that needs to be done before you just glibly pop off, Paul said X, Y, or Z. Are you quoting from an epistle that someone's going to come back and say he didn't even write it? And then what are you going to do if you've never even thought about it? You're left sitting there picking your nose. That's not a good position to be in. So I am seeing stuff like that. And I am seeing folks, giving that kind of thing. But I just simply say the other side, why am I not hearing anything here? The reason I'm not getting a response to this is because the only consistent way from that side to respond is to fundamentally say, yeah, you've got a different view of Scripture and scriptural authority. You seem to believe that you need to have that positive statement in divine writ to have a definition of the central authority structure for the New Testament church. Yeah, exactly. And you're saying you don't. That's the whole point. That's where the rubber meets the road. And so, yeah, there you go. Good old Todd. Todd, you're crazy.